Thank you, everybody, for your patience as we work through some technical challenges getting this webinar set up. I suppose in its own way, it's a great lesson in stress management in the heat of the moment. So let me go ahead and first introduce myself, and I do appreciate those of you who have both logged in and stayed patient with us while we have figured this out. So my name is Dan Rust. I'm the Vice President of Global Leadership Development and Talent Management for InfoPro Learning. And I do want to share just a bit about my background as we lead into this next hour-long session on energy and stress management for leaders. My background prior to InfoPro Learning, I was the commercial learning leader for General Electric. And you can see on the screen here my background prior to that, going all the way back to being a nuclear engineer aboard a fast attack submarine for the U.S. Navy. Now that goes back many decades, but with InfoPro, I do lead a team of developers, researchers, instructional designers, and the team that I work with has developed over 60 leadership courses that are delivered both in classroom environments and in virtual training environments. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because this overall library of courses was developed in response to conversations, observations, needs we had identified in our engagements with clients. And you can see in the center column at the very top, the topic of energy and stress management for leaders. Going back several years, I mean, obviously stress management has always been a leadership issue. Leaders inherently tend to live and work in worlds of high stress to some degree. And what we saw happening beginning just prior to the pandemic was this topic coming up very proactively in our conversations with organizations when they were telling us about the challenges that their leaders were facing. And we had a stress management program for leaders, which was gaining traction with many of our clients. And because it was gaining traction, we actually had our development team take a look at our program, and in the last 24 months, it's gone through a significant refresh, primarily because the stressors and the reactions to those stressors have shifted in the work landscape for many senior leaders. I'm going to walk you through that shift and walk you through why we feel this is an area of incredibly important focus for many leaders in today's world of work. And what I'm going to share over the next 50 minutes or so is a curation of content from our standard program. Our Energy and Stress Management for Leaders program is actually 6 hours of content. When it's delivered in a classroom environment, it's typically a one-day program with a cohort of anywhere from 20 to 25 leaders. When it's delivered virtually, it's typically delivered in 3 2-hour sessions, so a total of 6 hours of content over 3 2-hour virtual sessions. We've definitely learned that it's not fair or just good learning practice to expect anyone to spend 3, 4, 5, 6 hours at a time in front of a screen going through a virtual learning session. So our overall instructional design approach when it comes to virtual learning is having a series of 90-minute to 2-hour sessions, and then making those sessions as highly interactive and experiential as possible to keep everyone fully engaged. So that's the one big difference you'll see between our classroom sessions and our virtual instructor-led sessions is the segmenting into 90-minute to 2-hour chunks. But with that said, we're going to focus on, and as I said, I'm curating content. I'm not trying to compress 6 hours of content into 50 minutes. That's not fair to you. It really just wouldn't provide any value at all. Instead, what I've done is I've curated some specific topics and some specific content from the program that I think will provide real value to you. The goal of this is not to just sell you on our overall program or our larger program. It is to truly create value for you in this particular moment. So let's talk for a minute about personal energy and personal stress. There's definitely a linkage between the two. Energy management is different and distinct from stress management, but the two are very interrelated. So, for example, when it comes to short-term stress, you'll typically find that sudden short-term stressors tend to increase your energy. I mean, your body and your mind create a fight or flight response oftentimes, and those responses are actually energy boosters. You'll find that your blood pressure increases, the capillaries in your brain open up. You actually get an energy boost from a quick short-term stress response. However, when you have stressors that tend to be longer term, what some people might call chronic stressors, where you have a stressor that actually impacts you day in and day out over weeks, months, years, those chronic stressors, much like running a marathon, your first, now I say this conceptually, honestly, while I've run 10Ks, I've never run a marathon, but I've talked to marathon runners, and they will talk about the marathon high that they get at first when they're pushing themselves to their limit, and they get definitely an energy boost. But as the run continues and progresses, and as their energy stores are used up, they definitely get to a place of low energy where it just becomes the mental game of continuing to move yourself forward step after step after step. So to some degree, it is a relevant example when it comes to chronic stress management, because chronic stress tends to deplete our energy stores. And then depending upon what our personal energy habits and practices might be, if we are somebody who has like a really strong set of energy batteries coming from our health practices, our mental practices, our physiology, our spirituality, if that's one of your big energy batteries, so to speak. And we'll go into this in more detail in just a few minutes. But depending upon your energy stores or your energy batteries, if you're already depleted, if your health practices perhaps are not as optimal as they should be, if some of your other life practices really have not built up energy stores for you, then your chronic stress very, very quickly depletes those batteries, and then actually ends up being one of your stressors. It actually ends up creating even more stress because of the low energy condition that you're facing. So throughout the course of this webinar and our actual program, we look at both energy and stress, knowing that there is definitely an interrelationship between the two. And the focus of this webinar is specifically the world of leadership. So I'd like to just take a bit of time and talk through what I hear when I talk to leaders about what is stressing them out, what's creating the sense of overwhelm for them in their lives right now, today. Number one, I hear about information overload, data overload, task overload, project overload, people overload. It's perhaps always been this way. I mean, I'm a man of a certain age where I've got 3 decades of work experience under my belt, so I've been hearing about stress. I've been experiencing stress, for the last 30 years, but something distinct seems to have occurred, particularly in the last 10 years, and even more so in the last 2 years, where just the sheer volume of stuff is overwhelming many leaders, and they're struggling with just how to react. I spoke with a gentleman a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I was a big fan of the concept of inbox zero. And that concept, if you're not familiar with it, is a concept where you basically manage your work practices so that at the end of every day, by the time you finish your workday, as you wrap things up, your inbox is at zero. Everything that's come in has been put in its place. If it's a task if there's a task that needs to be done that's embedded with an email, it gets put in your to-do list. If just reading the email itself, if it's a lengthy email and it needs to be done, it gets dragged to either a meeting that you set up with yourself to read the email or a task list. But basically, your inbox gets emptied at the end of every day and gets converted into meetings, into tasks, into projects, or gets deployed to someone else. It gets delegated to someone else. So everything is done. It's a great concept. But this particular gentleman, he said, starting about a year and a half ago, the flow just became so overwhelming. I just couldn't keep up. It was taking too much time just to drag and drop everything, just to assign everything. He said, I haven't been at inbox zero in over a year and a half, and he's obviously stressed and overwhelmed because of that. So just the flow of stuff is overwhelming for many leaders today. What's also overwhelming is a sense of isolation. Many leaders, even pre-pandemic, pre-remote or hybrid work, as a leader, in many cases, you are isolated. You're the person who has to make the tough calls, who has to make the tough decisions. You are friendly with employees, but you can't be their friend. You are, close to, and you have close relationships with your employees. You have empathy for your employees, but because you are in a particular position of power and responsibility, there is a certain amount of isolation that comes with that. And then the world of remote work accelerates that or accentuates that sense of isolation. Many leaders have started to experience something called virtual paranoia, where even though, particularly if they're remote leaders or they're working in a remote environment where they have a team of people, in a dozen different places and a dozen different geographies, some perhaps at the home or corporate office, and some working remotely, that sense of isolation gets accelerated or accentuated, and the leaders do feel a sense of, again, this term that we're hearing is called virtual paranoia, where even when you do connect with people virtually a few times a week, even if it's daily, because you actually can't see them day in and day out. You can't walk out into a work environment and see people at their desks. You don't have that visceral sense of they're here and they're working and they're doing something, whatever it might be. You don't hear the buzz. You don't see the action. It can, for some leaders, create a sense of paranoia, which creates a sense of stress because you're wondering, what are they doing? Are they working? Are they active? Is anything happening? What work is happening? And if you've gotten used to in the past walking out into an office space and hearing the buzz, and it's given you some kind of subtle psychological comfort that stuff's happening, work's happening, and now you are losing that, or you have lost that, that in and of itself can be a stressor for some leaders, particularly if you have problems or issues that you feel are just on your shoulders. If it's coming down to you, where you've got things that you need to fix, you have things that you need to solve. And if you don't feel like you have a team that is stepping up to help you, particularly, again, in a virtual world, if you're used to having a team of peers, a team of colleagues who are also at a similar leadership level and who you can count on, that sense of, again, virtual isolation, even when you do connect with them once a week, the fact that you aren't able to stop by an office and just say, hey, you got 5 minutes? I just want to run something by you. The fact that you can't see them or don't see them in that very human way, just informally, day in and day out, and that you have to create a formal time to have a Teams chat or a Zoom chat. That, again, I know we're all working to try and make the world of remote work as human as possible and connect as much as we can. There's a certain formality to even an informal remote connection, an informal webinar connection, that as much as we try to make it replace what we used to have when we were all working together in a live environment, from a psychology standpoint, it doesn't quite match up. And so it can, again, create stress, particularly when there are specific problems that have to be solved, specific challenges that have to be solved, and we don't have the benefit of those day-to-day human connections that we've had in the past. Plus, in our conversations with leaders about what employees are expecting from work, what they're expecting from their organizations, what they're expecting from their leaders, there is absolutely a shift that has occurred in the last 3 years where employees want more. They want more from their work. They want to do work that matters. They want to do work that is significant. They want to avoid mundane grunt work. And they want leaders who have empathy for them. They want leaders who know them, who connect with them, who respect them, who help them grow. And they want jobs that have a growth trajectory that's relatively steep. They're looking to grow their careers rapidly, not slowly. And frankly, they're also looking for the best opportunity for them. So employees are in fact constantly shopping around, constantly looking. And technology is doing this to us to some degree. As much as I love LinkedIn and other, business social networking environments, man, LinkedIn serves up to you, job recommendations. And so you may not be someone who's necessarily looking for a job, but LinkedIn very easily lets you know that there are people out there looking for people like you. And so we end up with employees who are perceived as less loyal than they used to be, who really don't have a challenge with, even if, I've just taken a job and I'm in my second or third or fourth month on the job. We're no longer in an environment where an employee will say, well, look, I just took this job. I certainly can't entertain an offer from another employer or an offer from my previous employer or whatever. But now in today's world, it just happens, or happens more frequently than it ever did in the past. And leaders feel the pressure from employees today. They feel that employees want more from them, expect more from them, and at the same time, leaders are feeling the pressure from the top down. And I've had many leaders say to me, I feel like I'm caught in the middle. My senior leadership is putting a lot of pressure on me to produce results exactly the way we used to get results pre-pandemic, but I'm getting more pressure from the bottom up. So I'm caught in the middle, and nobody really appreciates what it's like to sit in my seat and feel the top down and the bottom up pressure. I had one gentleman, really good guy, in his early 60s. That was at least my impression. And he said to me, when I was growing up in our business, I felt like my job was to remove the pressure on my leaders. My job was to take things off of their desk. My job was to get things done for them and make their life easier, make their job easier. And he said, I don't get that so much anymore from the people we're hiring. They they come into our business and they want, they expect, they demand. And he said it's just different. He said I'm struggling with how to react to that because my initial gut reaction is to get frustrated and say that it is not my job to make your life easier. But in fact, in order to win the battle for the best talent, I'm finding I have to be a more accommodating and patient than I have been in the past. And so again, it's a true work stressor that's impacting a lot of leaders. And so then you end up with leaders under stress who then have what I call the butterfly effect or a butterfly effect throughout their organization, because you have a leader under stress who perhaps react sometimes in less than optimal ways. If you're familiar with the term butterfly effect, basically it's the concept that a butterfly halfway across the world flaps its wings, and based on the change in the air currents, that change of air currents affects other air currents and affects other air currents, and then suddenly not suddenly, but eventually you end up with a tornado or a hurricane halfway across the world, ultimately with the root cause of the butterfly effect of butterfly flapping his wings. Essentially, the concept is small actions in one place over time can create big outcomes in other places over time. And we do have to ask ourselves, do our leaders, when they're under stress, what sort of butterfly effect do they have in other parts of the organization? And there is absolutely no doubt that a leader who is responding to stress in a suboptimal way has a big butterfly effect throughout their organization. Whenever we do organizational assessments, organizational analysis, or we just dig in to assess the culture of a particular work group or an organization, oftentimes we find that stressed out leaders create stressed out followers, and you see the stress dynamic then throughout their working group or sometimes throughout their organization if the stressed out leaders are in the senior leadership team. So the reason for this entire introduction and sharing this with you is because we do view organizational stress, individual stress, leadership stress as a very critical organizational culture indicator or driver. And we know that if leaders under stress create employees under stress, here are just some of the things that you may see as indicators. Number one, just increase in error rate. If you've got employees who are making what you consider to be minor errors or dumb errors, or they're making grammatical errors or making typographical errors, or things are just happening where there's even a minor error rate that you see on the rise. Oftentimes those error rates, and sometimes the error is just getting things done late, not on time, or not on budget, or whatever the errors might be. An increase in error rate oftentimes is an indicator of either an individual's stress or a working group's stress. General poor work performance. When it comes to a stress reaction, oftentimes the reaction is fight or flight. And for most employees, it's flight. It is moving away. So sometimes poor work performance is a stress indicator. Obviously, mental health issues, when employees are feeling depressed, when they're feeling anxiety, whatever other mental health issues might be expressed on the job or expressed through actions on the job, those can be, again, an indicator of employee stress, as is burnout and increased conflicts in the workplace. So that leadership stress becomes an even more critical issue, and how leaders respond to stress becomes a critical issue, because it can and does often have an effect on their employees. So we want to help leaders cope with their stressors, both at work and at home, in order to, because there's also a reverse butterfly effect. If you've got a leader who is exceptional at handling stress, not only will it help her or him in their own work world, their coping mechanisms, their habits, their approaches to stress will also have a positive butterfly effect throughout the organization. At least that's typically what we've seen. One more potential downside of leadership stress is when a leader is overwhelmed or under a high level of stress, they tend to lean into their fast thinking bias. You may be familiar with Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. Here's the 30-second summary of the book. Leaders under stress tend to lean into their fast thinking mechanism, which is your instinctive thought process, your fast, quick thinking. And unfortunately, they tend to lean out of or away from their slow thinking mechanism, which is that thought process where you step back, you think about your thinking, you think about your process, you reflect on whatever the issue or the problem or the challenge might be, and you tap into your deeper reserves of discernment and your deeper reserves of creativity and innovation. But in order to tap into your slow thinking capabilities, you do have to have the time, the energy, the patience, and the thinking discipline to do that. And so, under pressure, leaders tend to over vector into their fast thinking. Now, fast thinking sometimes can serve us. So it's not that fast thinking is bad and slow thinking is good. It's that an over vectoring into fast thinking, particularly if it's not a thoughtful vectoring into fast thinking, can in fact be a real negative drain on an organization. And beyond fast thinking bias, when you are under stress, when you are under pressure as a leader, you also tend to have an amplification of lots of other common bias blind spots. So essentially, your entire thought process gets sub-optimized when you are under stress. And I'm not going to go through all of these biases here for this particular discussion or session, but you can see some of them, and these are just some of them, the main ones, and I'll just highlight one of them. Recency bias. That's the bias or the tendency to give more weight to whoever you spoke to most recently or whoever got your attention most recently. And you may have seen this in your work environment where you've got a leader who's a bit overwhelmed, who's got a lot of things going on, and the person who talked to him or her last tends to get the most influence over that person's thinking or over that person's decisions. And it's primarily because in that sense of overwhelm, they do become a victim of recency bias or have a greater tendency to become a victim of recency bias. But there are lots of other thought process biases that we become a victim to or can become a victim to if we are overwhelmed in our overall thinking. Um, so clearly, my goal in the first half of this dialogue is to emphasize how critical energy and stress management is for us as leaders in the world of work. We become better leaders if we can handle stress more effectively. We become better for our organizations. We become better for our people. But probably most importantly, we become better for ourselves, because if you are not managing effectively your approach to all of the things we've talked about, the information overload, the people issues, all of the issues that we've talked about, if you are not managing that effectively, you may have actually succumbed already without even realizing it to chronic stress. You may be experiencing chronic stress without even being able to identify it as a chronic stress condition. Chronic stress is essentially a consistent sense of feeling pressured and overwhelmed over a long period of time. And it manifests itself in different ways for different people. It can manifest itself as just an overall sense of malaise, like, I just don't feel the passion for the business that I used to feel. I'm still going to work, I'm still showing up, I'm still quote unquote doing my job, but I'm not doing it with the edge that I used to have for this business. It may be that you haven't actually lost your enthusiasm for the business, but chronic stress has just dampened your overall energy for the business. But beyond that, it might be manifested as weight gain. It may simply be that chronic stress is creating a higher level of cortisol in your system, and that cortisol is causing you to gain weight. Cortisol itself will cause weight gain. Even if you exercise as much as you used to, you may be saying to yourself, oh man, they say you gain 5 pounds every decade, and I seem to have aged then 3 or 4 decades in the last 2 years because I've put on 20, 25 pounds, whatever it is. The weight gain may be caused by an increase in your stress hormones. Chronic stress can manifest itself as depression, as anxiety, as paranoia. It can manifest itself as anger. If suddenly you find yourself having more of a temper than you used to, or being more paranoid than you used to be, or feeling like you need to be more of a driver. Yeah, people just aren't doing as much as I need them to get done. There are lots of ways that chronic stress can manifest itself. And what's insidious about chronic stress is that it tends to start slow. You're probably familiar with the metaphor of the frog, in the boiling pot of water. You put a frog in a pot of cool water and then put it on a stove, and then you slowly, warm it up and heat it up. And by the time, the frog has any sense that the water is boiling, the frog has already died. So chronic stress can actually sneak up on us this way. It doesn't happen like overnight. It happens over a long period of time, and can very slowly become a drain on a person's psychological resources and energy resources. And what research absolutely tells us is that chronic stress will damage your cognitive functions, it'll damage your physiological functions, and without treatment, chronic stress will shorten your lifespan. It'll cost you. And unfortunately, what sometimes happens is people don't recognize the chronic stress and they don't treat the chronic stress until something dramatic happens, like a heart attack followed by a quadruple bypass, or a, a, a life partnership breaking up and a divorce occurring, and only then does the person go through some process of revisiting their life, rethinking their approach. So my hope would be that if even in a small way, we grab your attention and help you focus in on this area before something dramatic has to happen to knock you across the side of the head to say, hey, wake up, you've got to deal with this because things are crumbling around you. So, in the next 25 minutes, we're not going to totally change your life, but I think we can share with you just a few quick tips that can be helpful. And if we can help get your attention to address some of these areas, that can actually be the best value you can take from this overall. So we know that there is this symbiotic relationship between physiological energy and psychological stress, and it's you can focus on either one of these. The things in life that lower your energy level do tend to increase your stress level, and the things in life that increase your stress level do tend to lower your physiological energy level. So, and you can focus if you're looking to make a change. If you're looking to make a change, you can focus on stress reduction or energy increase. You can focus on either one of them, and I think ideally you tend to focus on both. You find ways to boost your energy level and lower your stress level. Those two things in combination tend to produce the most or the most effective outcomes. So with that said, let's just talk very briefly first about the overall physiology of stress and one's reaction to stressors. And stress is a real thing. I don't want to give you the impression that we view stress as nothing but a point of view, and that stress, if you adopt the right mindset, stress will go away. The stress will not go away. Now you can minimize the negative impact on stress through your thought process, through your mental approach to stress, but pressures. And so one of the ways we help people understand that stress is, in many cases, about your perception, about your reaction to the stressor. So pressures do exist. Pressures happen. Pressures from other people, pressures from situations, pressures from workload, pressures from information overload. All of those pressures do occur. We interpret those pressures, and then those pressures either create stress for us or not. And we do have choices. We do have some degree of control over the amount of stress that does result from the pressures that are actually real. So let's just take one like very real world example. So here's a situation. You send out a report to the senior leadership team of your organization. and you really think nothing of it. You think this is what I've been asked to do. This is what I should be doing. It's almost yeah, and you put some real time into the report, whatever it might be, and the email goes out, and then your direct manager supervisor calls you into his office with some degree of urgency. Or if you're in a remote environment, he immediately wants a non-scheduled Zoom call or Teams call, pings you, and then you get on the call or you walk into the office and he immediately asks you, why didn't you review this with me prior to sending it? Going forward in the future, I don't want you sending anything to the senior leadership team without being me having a chance to review it. And there's a bit of an, let's just say, a bit of a tone in his tone, a bit of judgment in his tone. Doesn't necessarily say anything was wrong with what you sent out, but what was wrong was sending it out with his prior approval. Now, that's, I think a reasonable thing that we can all relate to. And some of us are going to have an instinctive fight response. And we're going to want to instinctively justify our actions. And I know myself, for example, I tend to be a fighter, and I could imagine myself in that situation immediately stepping into the fight, so to speak, and justifying what I did and why I did it and dialing the tension up. Others of us have an instinctive flight response where our instinct would be to, hey, I'm sorry, it won't happen again. And I didn't mean to cause any agitation at all. And we immediately take the flight response. We end the meeting as quickly as possible and get out of the room as quickly as possible. And then others will step into the natural tension, but not go toward fight or flight, but instead engage in some type of productive dialogue. But whether you have a fight or flight response or something that is more along the lines of what we would call engaged empathy with this person who is potentially providing a stressor for you, where you fall along those lines depends upon how you process the particular situation. A lot of it is all in your head. One person will process things one way, another person will process things differently. And so your fight or flight response, or what some people call, they'll call the flight response immobilization, getting locked up, not really knowing what to say, so saying nothing, and just wanting to end things as quickly as possible with an instinctive apology and get out the door. Now, the person who has that flight response will likely walk back to their office or close down the virtual meeting, and then they will chew on this again and again, and their stress will all be internalized with them. The person with the fight response is going to engage and basically dump the stress on the other person or dial the stress up for both themselves and the other person. And really, neither of those two responses tends to be ideal. Instead, the response that we tend to call engaged empathy, what that really means is you engage, you don't flee, and you engage with empathy. So you don't fight in your engagement, you empathize with the other person. Now, empathy doesn't mean you have to agree with them. So you don't necessarily have to agree that the boss was right to call you into his office. You don't have to agree that you should run everything past the boss before it goes up the chain of command. But you can have empathy for that other person's perspective and point of view, and then you can engage it with that level of empathy to explore, why is it important to him? Why is it a priority? What's the concern? Like, what's the concern under the concern? What's the issue under the issue? What is this person thinking might happen? And in fact, it could end up being something very simple, or as simple as, hey, I know when this thing goes up the chain of command, I frequently will get questions about it. I might get questions about it, and I want to be able to answer those questions. I want to be able to say, well, what was meant was this, or what was intended was this. So I just want to be in the information loop. I want to have a chance to be fully informed before things flow up. It could be as simple as that, or it could be butt covering, or it could be a lot of things, from really really bad to really good. It could be a lot of things, but you'll never really know until you engage with empathy with that other person. And I know I'm trying to summarize for the purpose of a webinar, I'm trying to summarize a lot of content into a short period of time. But the thing I would hope you would take away is number one, recognize your own tendency toward a fight or flight response. If you are someone who has a tendency toward a flight response, that tendency is probably going to be reflected in every area of your life. When you have conflicts with your children, when you have conflicts with your spouse or your life partner, when you have conflicts at work, when you have conflicts out in the rest of the world, they all tend to follow a similar pattern. If you're really thinking about your thinking and paying attention to your thinking, there's typically a similar pattern. So if you're a fighter, you will tend to fight. If you are a fleer, you will tend to flee in all of those environments. And thinking for a moment about your tendencies and then thinking about that term, engaged empathy. How could I potentially move from either fight or flight to this middle zone of I'm going to step into the natural tension, because there is natural tension. I'm going to step into the natural pressure of whatever this situation is, and I'm going to engage with empathy to understand the other person or people, to understand the situation. I'm not going to just instinctively agree. I'm actually going to engage authentically in a desire to solve the issue or address the issue, whatever it is, but also minimize my own personal anxiety or stress over the situation. And if you can take a moment to think about your thinking, that alone can in fact help to minimize your negative or suboptimal stress reaction. And I'll give you just one, personal quick example. Those of you who are still on the webinar, you probably noticed, or you obviously noticed, we started about 5 minutes late. Well, the individual who was supposed to be my producer for the webinar, frankly, just didn't show. And I didn't have the logins to just log into the webinar on my own. So for the 10 minutes leading up to the webinar, I'm experiencing anxiety. Ironically, it's a webinar on stress and energy management. And about 5 minutes in, or 5 minutes before the webinar, I said to myself, okay, Dan, use this. Don't just deliver it. Use it. And I paused for a bit to think through, what can I control? What can I not control? How can I leverage this stress energy? And ultimately, I was able to connect with somebody who was not the producer, but who had the login information, but they could only get me logged in about 5 minutes late. And I just decided mentally to use the energy that was being created for positive purposes and not to go down this downward spiral of shaming and blaming and anger and frustration. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't going to be some follow-up. There's going to be some follow-up and there's going to be some accountability, but it's going to come from a place of engaged empathy, because nobody does a bad job on purpose. I oftentimes have to remind myself of that as well. Nobody is a suboptimal colleague on purpose. Typically, it happens, for whatever reasons it happens, but generally it's not intentional. So with that, let's talk about energy batteries. And unfortunately, we only have about 7 minutes left. But the concept of personal energy and physiological energy is such a fascinating field of study, because there really is not a distinct dividing line between physical energy, mental energy, emotional energy, and spiritual energy. All of these elements do manifest themselves as a feeling of energy in our bodies, in our minds. So, some of us perhaps have more of a focus on physical energy than emotional or spiritual energy. But in fact, and some of us are exactly the opposite. We have more of a focus on our cognitive or mental energy or our spiritual energy. And what we mean by these three energy batteries, I'll describe them very briefly. Physical is the obvious one to explain. Physical energy is truly, are you taking care of your body, your true physical physiology, and do your physiological practices optimize your energy? It has it's everything from your exercise patterns to your sleeping patterns to your eating patterns and everything else that contributes or detracts from your physical energy. And I think in most cases, most of us know what we should be doing. What prevents us from doing what we should be doing is unique to all of us. And some people aren't prevented. Some people have absolutely fantastic physical energy habits and patterns. And we have a document that we call an energy audit. And we'll provide that document. We'll send out a follow-up email and we'll provide that document. It's just an audit document where you just walk through, you answer a series of questions, and it helps you assess where are your sources of energy, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual. Mental energy is cognitive energy, and some of us have habits that continually build our cognitive energy, and generally cognitive energy, it comes from using your mind, using your brain. If you don't use it, you lose it. So cognitive energy means having certain life habits and practices where you are consistently learning, working, using your brain, exercising your mental muscles. There's been lots of research to indicate that individuals who continue to use their cognitive muscles into their 60s, 70s, and 80s, they maintain their mental acuity into those age realms because they're continuing to use those muscles. Now, assuming they don't have there are certain debilitating diseases like Alzheimer's that can ultimately have a deleterious effect even if you are using your mental muscles effectively and continuously building them. But even if you do have debilitating mental disease, essentially, the more you exercise your cognitive muscles, you can actually minimize or at least reduce the deleterious effect of some of the cognitive decline diseases. Emotional energy has so much to do with how you think about yourself and relate to yourself, and how you think about other people and relate to other people. And management of your emotions, management of your relative degree of optimism about yourself and about the world and about the people around you. Emotional energy can feed into physical and mental energy, or it can detract from it. You can be someone who has great physical habits and great cognitive habits, and if at an emotional level you are racked by self-doubt, or you're racked by paranoia, or you're racked by pessimism, it can be a huge drainer for you, and it can actually drain out more energy than the other two are building in. And then I'm going to just finish up by talking about what we call spiritual energy. Spiritual energy can, for some people, mean adherence to their faith, but it can also mean adherence to something greater than just what we see right in the face of us. Spiritual energy is universal. Virtually every human being, even atheists who don't believe in a literal God, will oftentimes still tap into a spiritual energy, something greater than themselves, something that they see in the world that goes beyond just the physical realm right in front of us. And just because of our time limitation, we're not going to dive into great detail in any of these areas, but our concept of having these 4 areas of energy batteries and auditing your own habits, your own patterns, which of these batteries is strongest for you, which of these batteries could use a little boost. When you complete the energy audit document that we will forward on to you, it'll give you a sense of where you have the greatest opportunity to boost your energies. There are a couple of events that do have a tendency to be the big energy drainers in the world of work. Anytime you go into a new work environment, you get a new job, or you get a promotion where you're suddenly working with a new group of people with a new set of responsibilities. A new work environment can be a huge personal stressor and energy drainer. We talk about information overload. Information overload is one of the very strong, common stressors and energy drainers in the world of work today. Taking on a new leadership role, particularly your first leadership role or any other significant shift in a leadership role or assignment, is a huge stressor because there are new expectations, there are new energies that you're having to bring to this new role, this new world of work. And then one I wanted to kind of finish up on is for all of us, the first time you have a significant failure, your first failed project, big project, the first time you get fired, the first time there's any sort of big, particularly if it's a public failure or any significant, unusual, or prominent failure, is a huge drainer, a huge stressor. And we've seen situations, I'm sure you've seen situations of people who their reaction to their first failure just drains their emotional batteries, drains their spiritual batteries, ultimately drains their cognitive mental batteries, and it can be life altering. It can be hugely debilitating. So anything that you can do to, first of all, recognize when you're facing one of these major life circumstances, recognize that your batteries are being drained, and you may not be able to fill every single one of them up. But pick one. It may be that the thing that you can do tomorrow is start working on your physical or start working on your cognitive. But find a battery that you can work on to begin building your batteries up. And as I said, we have a personal energy audit document that we'll forward on to everyone who's signed in for this webinar. And it's just a personal exercise you can go through to give you a little bit of a sense of where you have opportunities. Beyond that, I'm ultimately, we're going to wrap up at this point, but you can see on the screen here that these other factors that can impact your stress and energy in the workplace. And we will follow up with you with the full documentation, give you some tips, guidance, some suggestions for how you can address each of these areas to enhance both your energy level and reduce or optimize your stress in the modern work environment. So with that, I want to be respectful of your time and end this exactly on time. So thank you for those of you who have stayed engaged throughout the webinar. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to follow up with us. We are certainly happy to answer any questions that you might have or continue the dialogue in any way that makes sense to you. So thank you so much.